On a cold morning in December 1995, a deputy sheriff patrolling the banks of the Provo River in Utah made a grim discovery. Lying face down in the snow and brush, partially submerged in icy water, was the body of a young woman. She was nude, covered in bruises, and her skull had been crushed by repeated blows with a heavy rock. She had no identification, no belongings, and no immediate connection to the area. The victim was soon identified as 17-year-old Krystal Beslanowitch. She had lived a short, difficult life, a girl caught in cycles of abuse, instability, and survival. She had been in and out of group homes, had worked as a sex worker, and was known to police in Salt Lake City. But to those who knew her, she was also warm, trusting, and vulnerable, just a teenager trying to survive. Her death was brutal, but what followed was worse: years of silence, cold trails, failed leads, and the quiet agony of a mother who never stopped waiting. For nearly 2 decades, her murder went unsolved. There were no eyewitnesses, no solid suspects, just bloodstains, broken bones, and a large granite rock with traces of DNA. The technology of the 1990s couldn't process it, but in 2013, a breakthrough would come. From a piece of equipment small enough to fit in the trunk of a car, and from a single speck of genetic material left behind by a killer who thought he'd gotten away. This is the story of Krystal Beslanowitch, and how a case long gone cold was brought back to life by science, persistence, and the weight of a single stone. Krystal Beslanowitch was born in 1978 and grew up mostly in Montana. Her childhood was far from stable. Her mother, Norma, struggled to keep the family together amid poverty and personal hardship. Krystal ended up in foster care, later running away and landing in juvenile detention. By the age of 17, she was living in Utah, working in Salt Lake City, and trying to find a way out of the chaos. She was known for her soft voice, big eyes, and a trusting personality that many would later describe as her greatest vulnerability. She had dreams, small ones maybe, but dreams nonetheless. She once told a friend she wanted to go back to school, maybe become a nurse. She loved animals and always tried to feed strays near the motel where she lived. A neighbor recalled how she once gave her own winter coat to a younger girl staying at the shelter. Krystal, despite everything, hadn't lost her empathy. Her mother remembered how, as a child, Krystal would sing quietly to herself when she was afraid. She loved rainstorms and old cartoons. Norma kept a shoebox of drawings Krystal had made, with clumsy but heartfelt crayon sketches of smiling families and sunshine. Those drawings became relics, windows into the girl who had once believed in something better. By late 1995, Krystal was living with a boyfriend at a motel in Salt Lake City. She was engaged in sex work, a fact that made her more visible to police and more vulnerable to predators. The motel she stayed in was one of many on State Street, a corridor infamous at the time for drugs, trafficking, and exploitation. Krystal's life was a fragile routine: motel rooms, quick cash, and the constant need to stay one step ahead of danger. On the night of December 14, 1995, she left her room and got into a car with a man. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Early the next morning, on December 15th, a deputy with the Wasatch County Sheriff's Office was patrolling near the Provo River, just outside of Midway, Utah. It was a quiet area, usually serene even in winter, but something in the snowbank caught his eye: a patch of dark hair against the white snow. As he got closer, the scene came into focus. A teenage girl lay face down and naked along the riverbank. Her body showed signs of extreme trauma. bruising, head injuries, blood on the rocks nearby. She had been beaten severely, likely with one of the very stones that surrounded her. Her skull was fractured. There were no tire tracks, no clothing, no purse or wallet, just a body alone in the cold. The killer had left her there, discarded like garbage. An autopsy would later confirm that she died from blunt force trauma to the head. The murder weapon was likely one of several blood-stained rocks found at the scene. Swabs were taken, evidence was collected. But in 1995, there was only so much science could do. The girl had no ID, but fingerprints eventually helped identify her as Krystal Beslanowitch. Her mother was devastated. She'd always feared this might happen, but nothing prepared her for the reality of it. The case was assigned to investigators with the Utah County Sheriff's Office. They canvassed the area. They looked into known offenders. They questioned people on State Street, at the motel Krystal had been staying at. But with no witnesses, no suspects, and no usable DNA, the case quickly went cold. Over the years, it was reopened multiple times. Detectives came and went. Tips dried up. Evidence sat in boxes. The rocks, still stained with blood, were stored in evidence lockers, as silent and heavy as the case itself. Years passed, and Krystal's story faded from public memory, but her mother never gave up. Norma called investigators each year, asking if anything had changed. Sometimes they returned her calls, sometimes they didn't. She kept photos of Krystal by her bedside, waiting for news that never came. In 2007, Norma even traveled to Utah to meet with detectives herself. She walked along the Provo River, quietly leaving flowers where her daughter's body had been found. "She's still waiting for justice," Norma said to a local paper, "and so am I." She began writing letters to lawmakers, asking them to increase funding for cold case units. She spoke at small town halls, telling Krystal's story to anyone who would listen. She didn't want sympathy, she wanted action. In 2013, nearly 18 years after Krystal's murder, a detective named Darren DeRollo with the Utah County Sheriff's Office decided to revisit the cold case. DeRollo had been reviewing unsolved homicides, and the details of Krystal's case stuck with him. The brutality, the lack of leads, the blood-stained rocks. Technology had come a long way since 1995. Forensic tools were now capable of analyzing touch DNA, trace amounts of genetic material left behind from skin contact, even on rough surfaces like stone. One of the newest developments was a portable, rapid DNA analyzer, a machine that could process genetic samples in a matter of hours. It was compact enough to fit in a car and powerful enough to read a profile from a microscopic smear. Investigators decided to resubmit evidence from the original scene. Among the items was one particular rock, the one believed to have delivered the fatal blow. For nearly 2 decades, it had sat in storage. Using the new DNA analyzer, forensic scientists extracted a partial profile. And when they ran it through the National CODIS database, it matched a man named Joseph Michael Simpson. Simpson had a criminal record, and in 1995, he had been living in the area. He had worked as a taxi driver and had ties to Salt Lake City. At the time of the murder, he was out of prison on parole after serving time for a violent offense. He had never been publicly linked to Krystal until now. Detectives began surveillance on Joseph Michael Simpson. He was now in his late 40s, living quietly in Florida. Investigators didn't want to tip him off. They wanted confirmation, something they could use to tie him definitively to the scene. Eventually, they obtained a discarded item containing his DNA. When tested, it matched the profile from the rock. In September 2013, Simpson was arrested and extradited to Utah. The charges: first-degree murder. During questioning, he denied knowing Krystal. He claimed he had no idea how his DNA ended up on the murder weapon, but the science was solid. The sample was direct. His presence at the scene, on the weapon, could not be denied. In court, prosecutors painted a picture of an opportunistic predator, someone who picked up a vulnerable teenager and then violently ended her life. The defense questioned the chain of custody and timing, but the evidence was overwhelming. One former roommate of Simpson testified that he had once made violent remarks about women he considered throwaways. The jury was visibly affected when photos of Krystal's injuries were shown. A forensic specialist described how the DNA was recovered from the rough stone, how even after all those years, the cells had remained intact. The testimony highlighted just how far forensic science had come. In 2016, after a lengthy trial, Joseph Michael Simpson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Krystal's family, it was a moment of closure, but not peace. 18 years had passed. Her mother had lived with the pain every single day. Justice came, but it came late. And for investigators, it was a reminder of how far forensic science had come, and how much still depends on determination, patience, and refusing to let victims be forgotten. Krystal Beslanowitch was buried in Montana, near her family. Her grave is simple: her name, her years, and a small message: forever loved. Her story is now part of forensic history, a case once lost to time, resurrected by a microscopic trace on a silent stone. She was just 17, and for too long, her name was just another file. But in the end, science spoke for her, and someone finally listened. And in a quiet corner of Montana, beneath a pale headstone, a mother finally found something close to an answer.